Have you ever been worried about what you will hear? Maybe you can't find any clean jeans or your favorite sweatshirt. The Bible tells us in Matthew 6:25, do not be anxious about your life and what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food and the body more than clothing? Anxious means to have unease or to be nervous about what might happen. Think about some times when you've been anxious or worried about things that probably aren't a huge deal, like food or clothing or what's going to happen tomorrow or about going to sleep at night. Write them down or think about them so we can talk about it. The Bible talks quite a bit about anxiousness, and it even tells us in Philippians 4:6, be anxious for nothing. Peter tells us to cast all our anxiety on God, who cares for us. Philippians 4:6 tells us how to combat anxious thoughts. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Take some time and pray and ask God to remove your anxiety and fear and trust Him. Name the things that you thought about one by one. Like if you're having trouble falling asleep at night, or you're thinking about the world and whatever's out in the world, or bad guys or anything like that, you can take any of those anxious thoughts to God and ask Him to give you peace instead of being anxious about that. So today in our lessons, we're actually going to be talking about clothing. And pioneer times, clothing was not something that was an easy thing.
Dinner. You hear the call from where you are picking berries. Tying up your sack and handling it with care, you begin running home. Even with the few berries you ate, your stomach is growling angrily, loudly protesting the hour. Your arm catches on a branch and you feel the fabric ripping before you can slow down. Oh no. You raise your arm to inspect the damage. Ma will have to add this to her darning pile tonight. Pa will surely admonish you for not taking more care. You stop running and walk a bit slower. This leaves you with only 2 shirts until it is fixed, and Ma's pile is ever growing with all your younger siblings' scrapes and snags. Clothing is not as simple as it once was back when you lived in the city and Pa used to work at the mill. Instead of simply buying it, much of your clothing is handmade with many steps and taking a lot of time and care. A sense of pride and thankfulness toward your hard-working parents rises up and seems to catch in your throat as you see the cabin up ahead. Time to eat. Pioneer clothing. Close your eyes and see if you can picture what you think pioneer families might have looked like. Today we are going to be talking about clothing, which was quite different from the finely woven cotton and polyester that we have today. Not only was the clothing made by hand, but the cloth was as well. If there is anything we have learned, being self-reliant was, and still is, a lot of work. Clothing was rougher, perhaps a bit itchier, definitely thicker and warmer, and made to last. Style was not nearly as important as functionality on the Western frontier, a conflicting goal from mainstream culture a few hundred years later. Let's take a look at some of the clothing that was common during pioneer times. Women covered as much of their bodies as they could to avoid sunburns, scratches, and bug bites. Their long dresses with long sleeves and high necks were accented by petticoats, which were underneath the skirt to give it body, and aprons, which helped their dresses stay clean longer. They usually only had a few dresses and took good care of them. They wore cloth or straw bonnets on their heads, and when it was cold, draped scarves and capes over their dresses to offer additional warmth. Young girls generally wore shorter dresses to move about easier and walk in mud and grass without ruining their clothing. Their dresses were much looser. Older girls, teens, would dress like their mothers, often using hand-me-downs throughout the years. Both boys and girls dressed the same as babies and young children in simple nightgowns, almost like a dress. This made it easier for moving around and cleaning up or changing their cloth diapers. Men wore trousers made of wool, cotton, or a combination of linen and wool called linsey woolsey. These pants were often darker in colors such as brown, gray, or black. They were a bit looser and often held up by suspenders. Shirts were loose and made of cotton or linen in the summer when it was hot, and wool in the winter when they needed more warmth. They often wore vests over top and button-up coats. Finally, many men also wore hats to keep the sun off. Straw hats were typically worn in summer, and fur, felt, or knit hats were worn in winter. Like girls, older teens dressed like their father. However, young boys had a slightly different wardrobe consisting of shorter, looser pants, or even shorts in the summer that were less likely to get damaged or dirty.
When you think of the Wild West, you probably envision denim jeans. But denim wasn't made into jeans until later. Jeans were patented in 1873. Before that, there were no zippers, and clothing was simpler, looser, and often homespun. Fibers to cloth. Do you know where your clothes come from? Well, we have factories, machinery, and synthetic fibers today, and the method has changed drastically. The process still follows a similar vein. Because clothing was so expensive to purchase, it was more common to spin and weave their own cloth. Pioneers did this by growing plants or raising animals with heavy coats that could be worked into long, stringy fibers and woven into cloth. Hold your shirt up or a piece of easily accessible fabric and take a closer look. Can you see the weave? You might need to hold it up to the light. Whether your clothing is cotton, polyester, wool, canvas, linen, or something else, it was made or inspired by nature. The very things we rely on for food also provide us with the clothes on our backs. It kind of puts it into perspective when God says He will provide food and clothing for us, doesn't it? Wool is made from sheep, fleece, which is washed, combed, and spun into yarn. The yarn is then woven together to make thick, warm coats or clothing. Leather is made from the skins of animals. Linen is made from flax plants, which go through a lengthy process to dry them, leave them out to rot, break them, scrape them, and separate them so the fibers are ready for spinning. Cotton is made from the fluffy bolls of cotton plants. These clumps of cotton are then cleaned and separated from the seeds and the leaves before they can be combed or carded and spun to prepare it for weaving. In developed countries, cotton picking is done with heavy machinery. However, through much of the 1800s and even today in some places, cotton is picked by hand through forced labor and slavery. Today, your clothing might be a mixture of natural and synthetic fibers, such as polyester, which is made from petroleum products. Did you know weaving yarn into cloth is done on something called a loom? To make fabric on a loom, a single continuous thread, called a weft, has to be processed over and under a series of parallel threads that are attached to the loom, which has a regular frame. The weft is wound around a quill or smooth stick in a shuttle, which looks like a little canoe, and then it's passed under and over the parallel threads. Confused? Check out the video that we're going to watch, and you'll be able to see what it actually looks like.
From cloth to clothing, once they had made their fabric, clothing had to be hand-sewn. Indians made their own sewing needles by carving animal bones. While this was something that could be done, it was more common for pioneer women to purchase and carefully look after the bronze and iron sewing needles. Sewing was a way of showing skill, workmanship, and creativity. Fine stitches, speed, and consistency were the marks of a talented seamstress. During the early 1800s, there were no zippers, so buttons were carefully sewn onto the edges of vests, trousers, and coats to fasten them. Hooks and eyes or ties were used on daintier dresses and women's clothing. Quilting, sewing scraps and squares together to make a blanket, was a social event where women gathered to visit and sometimes even work on a project together. Quilts were not just made for their function, but were also an opportunity to be creative and make something beautiful that could be left as a legacy for their children. Once clothing had been sewn, it had to be maintained, and this was done through a skill called darning. Instead of covering a rip with a patch, it was woven together with thread or yarn, first making long stitches in one direction, and then going over and under the threads in the opposite direction. Darning was much more durable than a patch. It was more commonly done with home-knit clothing such as socks, scarves, cloaks, or sweatshirts. However, it could be done with a sewing needle and thread as well. Items to be mended were placed in a basket to be worked on in the evenings as the family settled in. It was then that mothers, teenage daughters, and grandmothers alike put their sewing needles to work, mending all the rips and holes in the family's clothing. It was a lot of work to keep everyone clothed without sewing machines or iron-on patches, but it was done with love and care.